All right, now we're going to check out the back porch here. This is the kitchen porch. This is the door that led to the pantry. It's walled off now, and that is an office for members of staff. And then where this little section is right here is where that stairs that you can see. Let's go in here and look at this really quickly. So you can see this set of stairs here and how that's open. That's that right there. And then, so this is our view from the back porch. And so what you can see here is you can see the kitchen garden. And so that's where they would have grown their produce. This is what would get them through, their fresh produce through the growing seasons. And then they would also grow as much as they could to be able to put by for the winter whenever things weren't growing as well. And they could continue growing through here as long as they kept their soil nutrient rich. They have a lot of cold hardy crops that as long as the frost doesn't land on it, they'll continue growing. So they have these hoops that they put over that was made out of painted like paper or cloth, and it allowed the heat from the sun to kind of build up in there like a greenhouse, but it kept the frost off of things. And then, of course, you have herbs in here as well, because this was, they were seasoning and spicing their foods too. But this was also kind of their pharmacy as well. So how today we go to the store and get Benadryl for having allergies or Pepto-Bismol if our stomach is upset. They did the same thing back then, except for instead of going to the dollar store, they'd go to their herb garden. And they would make foods from here. And Minerva would have been in charge. The mistress of the plantation was generally in charge of taking care of the health of the enslaved population. So if some of her slaves came up and they were really sick, they would get peppermint tea or lemon balm tea, and that would kind of help that out. So things like that were grown in here. And then, of course, like I said, you'd grow plenty to be put by for the winter months when things aren't producing. So the enslaved population would tend this garden. There are some accounts of, the mistress of the plantation and her kids coming out and working around in the gardens as well. I really doubt they did a lot of the manual labor. Minerva, most likely, especially with her health, did not do the manual labor most likely. She did have a rose garden that she liked to hang out in, and of course she could have been taking care of that, but the hard labor would have been done by her enslaved population out here. And then, of course, you see we have the spring house here. And we'll talk about that more in detail in a later post. But basically, that's their freshwater source. This is Park Hill Creek here, and that empties into the Illinois River about 2 miles that way. The hill on the back side of the property was where George had his orchards. It's also really possible that the enslaved town or village or community houses, whatever they were, would have been back here. And then in that direction there is where Arch Campbell lived, and his house was said to have become the house for James Latta, who was the overseer for the Merles. And so his place was there, and then Chief Ross's plantation was in this direction over here. And so since one of Chief Ross's enslaved were married to one of the Merles enslaved, there's a possibility that right back in that area there was where the slave cabins were, and that's where they all kind of lived. So they may have had a little slave community there that would have been right in the center of Hunter's Home, which is where I'm standing now, Chief Ross's plantation right next to us, Arch Campbell's place, and where James Latta lives, so the overseer there, and then Worcester Mission was straight that way. So they would have been kind of kept there in the center. Now, the reason why it would have been important for that is because around the time that the enslaved cabins are being built, since we know the Merles were living in the mansion by 1845, we're not quite sure where all the enslaved people were living at that time. I don't know if their homes were getting built before, during, or after the Hunter's home was built, but in any case, 1842 is when the Great Cherokee Slave Uprising occurred, and that was when a group of enslaved people locked their masters up in their cabins and their homes, stole a bunch of guns and food and things, and took off towards the border for Mexico. They were caught by some people down in Choctaw territory and brought back up here, and of course they were punished, and there were a couple people who were hung from it, and then some of the slaves were put, like Rich Joe Van, he had an enslaved person that he whipped and then sent to work on one of his steamboats on the river, that kind of thing. So by this point, they were wanting to make sure that their enslaved people were kept in a place where they could keep an eye on them. Another thing, though, was right after removal, what's basically a Cherokee Civil War broke out. So with the Treaty Party and the Ross Party fighting one another, and they were hurting each other's property, which included their enslaved people, and so they would have wanted to make sure that they were kept safe as well, so that they couldn't be damaged, because they were property. They were used like tractors and farm equipment and things like that, so they would have wanted to make sure that they weren't damaged in the conflict. Now on this side of the property is where they had he had a huge barn over here, a walnut barn. When we did pro bono archaeological work out here, we have some people from OU that come out, and archaeologists, and they come out and they do pro bono work for us, where they're looking at the archaeology of the site to kind of determine where it's safe for us to start building back the plantation, which is what our goal is. And so they found the foundations of the barn over here in this direction, and then of course you have kennels and stables. He had the kennels because he was a fox hunter. He had to have a place for his dogs. Stables, pigeon coops because they ate pigeon back then, like we eat chicken, that sort of thing. And then, of course, you've got the creek, and then your barn, possibly a mill. There was a grist mill somewhere along the property over here. And there was a lot of stuff going on this side of the property.